Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the LGBTQI2-S Learning Community. I want to thank you all for joining us on the day before what is a holiday for many of you, and maybe you're starting your holiday right after this presentation. So thank you for joining us. This particular forum is for all system of care partners, and we really want to use it to develop a deeper understanding of the strengths, the challenges, and the issues that face our youth and young adults who are sexual orientation and gender identity diverse. This was a learning community that came about as the result of listening to our communities and states that are in the field doing this work, saying that they really did want a place where they had an opportunity to connect with the community, to share and to gather some new resources with other advocates and other professionals and communities from across the country. Always with the goal to provide more effective services and support. So this month's learning community is really about providing an opportunity to share the successes and challenges of our own community's Pride events from the last month, and we'll also talk about how communities responded to the tragedy at Pulse, a gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida, that took the lives of so many. So my name is Kathy Lazear, and I'm with the Technical Assistance Network, the National Training and Technical Assistance for Children's Behavioral Health, and sponsored by the University of Maryland at the Innovations Institute. I'd like to welcome today our facilitator who facilitates our learning community calls, Dr. Peter Gamache. Peter has provided TAs probably to many of you out there and to many states and communities and localities and organizations on topics of behavioral health disparity impact and also around the LGBT population. We will be recorded today, and the recording will be made, as well as the slides will be made available a few days after the call. It may be a few days, Monday's a holiday, after that. And also we will be muting the line, and we'll open up the lines. And we have a smaller than usual group, so I'm really hoping that at the end of Peter's presentation that we will be able to have a little bit of a discussion around this topic to hear from you all and some of the things that you've experienced in your own community. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Peter Gamache. Peter?
Hi, everyone. It's great to connect with you today. We're going to talk about community resilience and conflict resolution. This was selected as a timely topic given the recent events that we've been seeing. And just to make the statement that this learning community is hosted by the University of South Florida's College of Community and Behavioral Science, Department of Child and Family Studies, which is a partner in the National TA Network for Children's Behavioral Health, operating and coordinated by and through the University of Maryland. So our outline today of our discussion is to talk about what went on at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando recently, some immediate and short-term reactions, in addition to some context surrounding that event, to think a little more broadly about what that event means. Sometimes with different media reactions, it can seem very short-term, but this is in light of a larger context that we're seeing, as well as the local impact within Orlando and Tampa Bay, which is about an hour from Orlando, and where University of South Florida and other behavioral health providers are located. And then we'll talk about what this means, some implications for SAMHSA's definition of trauma. Certainly it's relevant and applicable in trauma-informed care, the need for trauma-informed care, and really to look at constructive ways forward. These events are sobering and definitely just terrible tragedies. We all have to think about how this transforms into resilience, community resilience, and conflict resolution, because that is definitely what is needed when we see these things happening. So this happened in June 12th, 2016, which is really the Sunday, but at a nightclub. It starts the night before, and from about 2 a.m. to 5:15 a.m., a 3-hour plus span, there were people who were killed at this nightclub. 49 were killed and 53 were injured, and this was the deadliest mass shooting in recent history and we have definitely seen other mass shootings, but this was unique in terms of the numbers of people involved and really how it was handled as well. And here are just some pictures that from NPR that from people waiting outside and really trying to figure out what was going on. And this is the picture of on the right of the outside of the nightclub where they had to basically, tear through that wall in order to have the hostages to get to them and to access the inside there. So this was an LGBT nightclub. It was a Latin night theme. But it's important, I think, to think about it's not just LGBT people that were inside. It was their friends and, other people who were there and even family members. So LGBT people and not LGBT people, younger and older folks, different races, ethnicities, right? So even though the Latin theme nightclub LGBT, this is a broader thing that we're seeing, and this is just a layout of the inside, which is, I think it's kind of interesting to think about, how people were inside of it, there to have a good time and meet with their friends. And on the very left side is the sort of restroom area, which is where hostages were kept and where those holes were burrowed into the wall to let people escape. And I'm sure you've seen different things from the news. We saw that Omar Mateen was the attacker who threatened to detonate explosives and put bomb vests on people, and the weapons that were used were legally purchased, the Sig Sauer assault rifle and handgun. A third weapon was found outside in his vehicle. And so this person was married twice and had a 3-year-old son. And there were interesting sort of reports that came out afterwards about people saying that he had visited the nightclub previously, was seen on gay dating apps. So you just kind of wonder what was going on. This is different reports were made. So and this is the official account, and how the FBI will announce and release the final report on this. Well, it's pending, but we are seeing things from the media about different things that people are saying. So the motivations, we always try to reflect on why this happened and what led this person to doing this. I don't think we'll ever really know the full extent of the motivations. There were some allegiances with different terror groups and multiple and conflicting terror groups, even those that are fighting each other, in different parts of the world. So it just didn't really make sense that there was just one thing or one allegiance, and these other groups across the world they've not claimed responsibility or affiliation. So it's interesting to kind of see how this is being shaped from a political standpoint as well as social standpoint. But I think that the point here is to understand, that this was a person that a lot of things failed for this person, personally and socially, and within his own community. There were reports about, having made previous threats against people, and that he was under FBI watch lists and other things. But there was definitely lots of different failures along the way to have potentially prevented this from happening. And some of the reactions, I think that happened are very poignant when we see how reactions were across. This was not just Orlando and Florida and even states. There were things that were all across the world. Some of the things that we saw from different countries reacting and lighting up their buildings and showing that they're allies, and different candlelight vigils held all across the world for people in different countries. So it's definitely a global response to, and not just a local response. And I mean, just millions and millions of people in different events across the world. So I think that that's important to reflect that people have come together around this. Just more pictures that were in different areas. And some of the things that we saw, different signs that people were holding up and pictures, and love will always win against LGBTI hate and solidarity, and not to let this promote Islamophobia. And I think that those are also important things to consider. And then we saw, of course, things on social media. Oh my gosh, you couldn't go to Twitter or Facebook or some of these other social media platforms, and it was just a constant scroll of different stories. So, different resilience messages like, sorry haters, you just made us stronger, right? Things like that. So, this is the type of reactions that we started seeing. But I think it's important to look at this in a broader context. Certainly, violence toward the LGBTQI2-S community has been an ongoing issue, and these are just examples of things that especially LGBTQI2S people see in their own media, that are reported. You'll be looking at seeing stories of, different events and things that are going on, and then it'll have a story about, yet another person was attacked recently, or, outside of a, bar or nightclub or wherever, this outside of a nightclub thing has definitely been a trend. And then we've had horrific things that have happened to individuals. In 2008, there's Lawrence King, the 15-year-old who was shot and died, and Jorge Mercado in 2009, who was killed, shot, and burned, and just horrible hate crime things. So this is, not just the one event. It's about, a string of different things that we're seeing. We can actually, even create a timeline about this. Certainly Matthew Shepard was the big event that was personally, when I was in high school and, when this event happened, it was just incredibly just powerful for reflecting on, what is going on here with, people who are being targeted, and the violence that we see against the LGBTQI2S community. So, and of course, there's an even broader history when we see historical trauma within the community, where, certainly HIV and AIDS through time, and how this has been a real source of stigmatization and anti-other actions toward this community. That's just to make the point that our community has, we know how to do a vigil, that's for sure, from the HIV/AIDS, that time, and this new event, the recent event that we've just had, it's yet another area to think about, what this means for transforming something intensely negative into something that brings people together, and something that we can try to think about how we can have constructive ways forward. And I think the lessons learned from the sort of HIV/AIDS era of lots of different people dying of HIV and AIDS, that this is something that has had an enormous transformative effect in many positive ways for people living with HIV. So I think that there are definitely lessons learned for coalition building. And then, of course, outside of the LGBTQI2S community, certainly this is not a new event in terms of mass shootings. Here's a map that shows that mass shootings across the United States have occurred all across the United States in different areas to different degrees and intensities. But this is definitely, it seems to be a trend of what we're seeing. It's not just an isolated event. And then when we look at different maps, there's different ways of looking at the numbers. This year, it's just a map of this year alone, right, since February 2016 of this year. So, this is a trend now. I mean, just this year alone, we're seeing spots all over the map coming up for mass shootings. So, the tracking of it and the awareness of it needs to definitely increase and string them together. Really, it's not just the one event, as I mentioned in the media, where terrible and awful, and people kind of try to move on from that or not think about it or whatever. But it's here's a trend of a timeline, right, with different major events. And here we have Columbine over here, and we have the Navy Yard shooting recently, and different things. So this is definitely something that we can look at across the timeline. And even from a calendar perspective, right? This is last year's calendar from last year. I mean, it's almost like, you can just color in the days of how long it's been since, and how close together some of these things are. So, definitely several per month, right? So, from a timeline perspective, these things, it's a trend that we're seeing. And when we look at the victims of these mass shootings, it's not just the individuals that are affected, certainly. It's, using Bronfenbrenner's ecological framework, which shows us that, I think of this framework as a pebble being thrown into a pond, right? And there's this ripple or echo effect outside of it, where the pebble lands. So there's the individual perspective who's surrounded by their individual relationships, which are then connected to their communities, and then, of course, social, societal aspects of this. So we definitely saw with the Orlando event, the individuals who were affected, and then there were different stories and different reflection points around their family members and people who were related to them and their friends, and then the community, the larger LGBTQI2-S community, but also the other communities as well that intersect, Latin community, the Orlando community and others, and then the societal aspects of looking at the echo effect of this, of course, all across, as I mentioned, the globe, across the world. So there's definitely different aspects to this to look at. And so the victims, when we think about an event like this, a terrible event like this, these are really diverse people by race, ethnicity, gender, age, religion, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic background, and other components of the demographics or ways of looking at people, types of different people. Very diverse people are being affected by this, for sure. And this was definitely reflected by President Obama's statement, which I thought was extremely poignant. He said, "This is a sobering reminder that attacks on any American, regardless of race, ethnicity, or sexual orientation, is an attack on all of us and on the fundamental values of equality and dignity that define us as a country." And this was his most recent comment about the Orlando event, but these are common types of statements that he makes to make sure that this is not just, us versus them, right? And if we get into thinking about us versus them and us versus this, different types of people by race, gender, religion, etc., we're falling into the hands of what basically the terrorists are trying to do, is to divide people. And so this is an attack on all of us. And some of the local impacts that we saw, I work with a lot of mental health and behavioral health service providers locally and in this region and across Florida. We certainly saw an increase in crisis counseling services, as well as no-shows and cancellations. And this included people who were, even clients who were there that night or were friends with people who were there. And so, this is, as I mentioned, Tampa is just about an hour drive from Orlando. So we definitely saw as reactions the next several days over that, especially that first week for crisis counseling and the need for that. There were certainly feelings of confusion and fear and anger, loss and mourning, guilt and lack of control, etc. Not just the classical stages of Kubler-Ross's stages of loss and grief, which is that denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But it was really all over the place in different ways, right? People just, lots of chaotic reactions where people were trying to make sense of, what was happening. Should we be angry about this? Do we need to be mourning? Should we be feeling guilty? And, things like that. So, just lots of different reactions. Definitely a need for guidance and support services. And I thought it was interesting that there were different reactions in terms of speculation, all right? So we saw immediate conversations, national conversation and local conversation. Is it better to have more guns or less guns, right? So, and I'm not going to wade into that on today's call, but, that was definitely the topic of conversation, whether it's better to have more guns or less guns in a nightclub or, different things. Why didn't somebody rush the shooter, right? All of a sudden people are experts on counterterrorism and hostage negotiation, right, online and, in conversations that you may have been having with others. Frustrations of policymakers, right? Definitely the sense that there were we're sending thoughts and prayers, right? And that was a nice gesture that was sent out, but there was definitely a reaction to we don't just want thoughts and prayers, or that there needs to be action, or there needs to be policies, or things like that. So lots of different for and against types of ways of thinking about this. And then if I was there, I would have done this or that. And I think it's interesting, right, when people say things like this, because they weren't there, right? If you weren't there, you weren't there. And the whole, why shouldn't somebody have rushed the shooter or whatever it is? I mean, if anybody understands going to a nightclub, you're there with friends, right? Typically a small clique of friends that typically, stay around each other. And when I can just imagine that if somebody's, some issue of violence or some kind of, even when people get into fights, which happens sometimes in a nightclub, right, you don't just rush into that, right, or you're pretty much there to protect your friends or, to get away from it or whatever, so, and this was also, it was a nightclub, right, so people were drinking or, inebriated or whatever, in other different ways. They're there to party or even, just hang around their friends and drink soda or whatever. It is also dark inside the club. So, that's kind of how a nightclub is. So I don't know these beliefs around, what could have, should have, would have happened, if that's even helpful to think about that. But I definitely couldn't wait to go out the next weekend, right, to hang out with my friends and talk about some of this and, to go out to a nightclub even, and not be afraid to, because I think that, when we start changing our lives and being afraid of things, living our lives, I think that that's a real problem when things like this happen. It's like you're kind of letting the terrorists win. So I think it's important to think about trauma, but certainly, to reflect on SAMHSA's definition of trauma, because this is certainly a traumatic event for this community and for others in terms of primary trauma and secondary trauma. So SAMHSA, I know some of you are familiar with this, just to reflect on this. So SAMHSA defines trauma as individual trauma that results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Right, so these dimensions of wellness that SAMHSA talks about, that it's not, if someone's mental health is related to all kinds of different aspects of mental, physical, social, emotional, spiritual well-being, that trauma really touches upon and affects all these different dimensions of a person's life. And when we think about trauma-informed care, how this gets professionalized and implemented in different programs and services that are funded by SAMHSA. Trauma-informed care is conceived as a program, organization, or system that realizes the widespread impact of trauma. So that's what we're doing today, is thinking beyond the singular event, and understands potential paths for recovery, recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved with the system, and responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. Right? So part of addressing trauma is not only providing trainings, which are important, such as today's learning community event, to reflect on educational events and provide resources, but also to integrate knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. So policies and procedures, making sure that organizations are making sure that they're looking at trauma and detecting trauma within their organizations, and also having policies in place for services to align with needs of different clients. So I wanted to provide an example. I know that the text on this is very small because it's very difficult to get a 8.5 by 11 image on one slide. But this is a document that was created. What I had done is, and I wanted to share with you, was there was a conference, and this was held in Mississippi, statewide system of care conference held at the Jackson, the state capitol's convention center. And what we did is that all these systems of care representatives from all across child and youth serving systems were attending this conference, 2-day conference, to learn about trauma-informed care. And so I did the evaluation form for it and wanted to understand their personal and professional affiliation, if they're working for a mental health organization or school system or faith-based organization or other types of organization. And then to understand what organization in their local area provides trauma-informed care. So is it first responders? Does the faith-based organization in your local area provide this? Child welfare, other areas, medical professionals. And wanted to also ask, if you find that someone needs trauma-informed care, right, so you know that someone's had a traumatic event or experienced something traumatic, how would you provide help? And the responses here says, that they would provide help directly, that they're trained in trauma-informed care, they're a therapist, for example, or a counselor, that they're maybe not trained in trauma-informed care themselves, but they refer to somebody within their organization who is trained, that they would encourage someone to, connect with an external organization, right? So it's more like a referral. I don't know, or simply, or some other response. And so, to understand, what would you do, right? And I think that's important. What would you do if you knew that somebody had experienced trauma? And so some of these responses that we saw were very interesting, especially I don't know, or, I would, if they would refer to an external organization, then if there aren't any in their local area, right, so what would people do? So this is kind of thinking about how do people fall through the cracks, right, or did they go unserved because lack of awareness or lack of, policy or some type of practice within an organization to address this. And then we also asked, if you're a professional, does your organization screen for trauma on your intake form, right? So are they literally detecting in some way trauma or screening for trauma when people come in the door? And certainly the vast majority, and even among some organizations you would expect that they would, they did not. So, this is one of those gaps analysis ways of looking at opportunities to have a system-wide, a system of care around trauma, that everyone, is addressing it and knows where the resources are, or, has a policy in place or some type of service or practice or training in place to address this. And then on the second page of this evaluation was the learning objectives of the actual trauma-informed care conference. So understanding, the components of trauma and, things like that, and the sort of learning objective areas, to what degree were those addressed by these sessions. And then, areas to also talk about the before and after aspect of commitment toward trauma-informed care. So it's got a scale from not at all to completely, and then we asked, and again, that's the last part of it, a little bit cut off because of the sizing of the image, but we asked a before and after question, right, to say, well, before the conference, what was your commitment toward trauma-informed care? And now that you get into this wonderful 2-day conference on this specific aspect of what systems of care can do, what's your commitment now? So we had some wonderful data that came out of this, and I'm not going to kind of go through the specific, data report. I'll spare you that, but, internally, this is the type of thing that was used just as an example to share with you, how trauma-informed care can be addressed and how, the gaps and the needs within a system of care can be assessed and then addressed. And I just wanted to share the guiding principles of trauma-informed care, just at a high level. Certainly the first guiding principle is safety, as well as trustworthiness and transparency, peer support and mutual self-help, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues, right? Recognizing historical traumas. So these are the major guiding principles of trauma-informed care. And to get into more detail around this, I would encourage you to go to SAMHSA's website. There's a wonderful publication called Tip 57, and that's Trauma-Informed Care and Behavioral Health Services. And the snap, whoa, okay, a little audio right there. The snapshot description of this Tip 57 is that trauma can affect a person's functional ability, including interacting with others, performing at work and sleeping, and contribute to responses including isolation, anxiety, substance misuse, and overeating or undereating that can increase health risks. Right? So these are the sort of symptom-related things that can contribute to dysfunction for an individual. It's a wonderful publication. I would highly encourage you to look for this. And if you don't have to remember Tip 57, you can, but if you just want to Google, trauma-informed care and SAMHSA, I'm sure this will come right up, the resource. So I think it's important to think about resilience and the positive aspects, right? We have to convert intensely negative and challenging adversity into things that are much more positive, and that's so we don't get mired in the problems and the deficits, and it can be depressing, very honestly, to just think about problems all day long. And a lot of system of care organizations, right, they're addressing gaps and needs and challenges and problems, and that it's certainly part of it. But we got to flip this around as professionals and service providers into things that are positive. Otherwise, it'll just very much eat away at what our worldview can be. It can't just be negative. So promoting resilience is an important aspect of this, and it's defined. I don't know if you're familiar with resilience, the specifics around resilience, but some of the definitions are that it's a risk factor that's been averted or unrealized. Right? So a risk, when we talk about risk and protective factors, risks are the negatives or some of the challenges, and protective factors are the things that are helpful and work to undo the negative aspects of risks. So something that's been averted or unrealized from a risk perspective is about resilience. The phenomenon that individuals have a relatively good outcome despite suffering risk experiences. Right? So when we see youth that are in abusive family environments, for example, and we see some that do well despite having grown up in an abusive environment, right? That means that they're quite resilient, and we want to think about what they had as resources for them to be resilient, right? Whether it's in personal or social contributors to that. So, for example, I grew up in a household that had certainly several challenges, I shall say, from a family standpoint, and have done relatively well. Well, part of that is because I had someone who worked for a behavioral health organization in my neighborhood, a friend's father who was very helpful for my upbringing. So that's just a personal, to share that aspect of things. But, when we think about why is it that some youth, they get into juvenile justice, or they get into substance abuse, or they get into, lots of different negative things in their lives, and then we compare that to other youth who grew up in similar environments, well, what are the components of why some of those youth have done relatively well? I think that's important to think about in terms of resilience. And the third definition is a class of phenomena characterized by patterns of positive adaptation in the context of significant adversity or risk. Right? Patterns of positive adaptation. So this means that it's not just a singular event or a singular resource, that they have a social network of support surrounding them, a system of care. And promoting resilience as a new lens is about not just looking again at those negative aspects of what's going on, with different communities or different groups of people. Kathy's very much been part of promoting looking at asset-based approaches, and several of my other colleagues and I are very much trying to sort of turn the wheel from deficits, problems, and risks to looking at resilience, and so looking at the inversion or the flip side of some of these challenges. So when we see a report, and this is an example of data that we see, this is the GLSEN report, the schools report for LGBT youth that are within the schools, the students in school systems across the United States. We see reports that focus on feeling unsafe at school because of their sexual orientation, for example, at 61%, and this is a national survey. They felt unsafe. Well, the question to ask is, well, what about the other percent, right? What made the 39% feel safe? What made them resilient? 28% dropped out of school due to peer harassment. What is it about the 72% who stayed in school? And then 31% who did report an incident said that school staff did nothing in response. These are common things that we see when we look at schools when there's harassment or bullying against LGBTQI2-S youth, is to ask, okay, 31%, that's terrible that, a third, there was nothing that was done. What about the other 69%? What was done? What are the things, the model things or practices that can be implemented or addressed, right? Or things, they were positive things that happened. So this is the way to look at, at the other side of some of the challenges and negatives. And certainly resilience is important because we know that early and continuous attachment positively shapes relationship development in later years, right? This is why it's especially important among youth to make sure that things are in place at an earlier age, at the earliest age possible, to promote resilience. Protective factors in one setting can compensate for risks in multiple settings, right? So this is living in a neighborhood where there are challenges, and the positive protective factors in school systems, for example, in a different environment can compensate for risks in other environments. Positive social relationships moderate the relationship between stress and distress. Certainly, friends and family members are important. Affirming faith experiences contribute to less internalized negativity towards LGBTQI2S people, more spirituality and psychological health. Right? So affirming faith experiences, those that are welcoming and inclusive and promote diversity and inclusion. Family support and acceptance explains adolescent comfort and resilience in later life. Right? So Family Acceptance Project in California is definitely a model program that we always point to show that family support and acceptance is critically important for positive development. And when we look at conflict resolution as another strategy to address the negativity that we see, the adversity within communities, I think it's very illustrative to learn about really what Martin Luther King was saying in his letter from Birmingham jail. And I love that publication. It's wonderful, and I highly, if you haven't read it, certainly it's not that long. You can Google it and pull it right up and read through it. It's a wonderful resource and something to definitely learn from. And because he was talking about the nonviolence campaign, and he talked about the 4 basic steps. And it started with the collection of the facts to determine whether injustices exist, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. So those are the 4 main components he was discussing. So applied is a learning opportunity for the LGBTQI2-S population, and this event, if we put it into the context of what happened in Orlando and other series of violence events that we've seen, collecting the facts, right, understanding that there's a broader context of LGBTQI2S violence and historical trauma. We can look at disparities in terms of likelihoods and different studies around youth, children and youth who are growing up who are LGBTQI2S in terms of their experiences with depression and harassment in school and substance abuse and homelessness and ideation to commit suicide and verbal and physical violence that they experience, right? Understanding the adversity is definitely important to collecting the facts. And negotiation, if we were to apply Martin Luther King's concept of negotiation, it's really addressing policies, procedures, and practices to reduce and eliminate unjust treatment. So how do we do that? How would the system of care have negotiation within their own organization to address policies, procedures, and practices, which, again, it aligns with the SAMHSA's concept of trauma-informed care, policies, procedures, practices, right, institutionalizing or structuring how organizations respond to trauma. And part of this negotiation is to institute a safe zone, right, to have respectful places that are well-known and promoted, right, and this can happen. I've seen this in many different behavioral health organizations where they will have different signage in their waiting room, in their conference rooms, in their youth group meetings, right, and it sets the tone, and it says this space respects all aspects of people, including race, ethnicity, gender expression, sexual orientation, socioeconomic background, age, religion, and ability, right? So it's promoting safe zones, and it's, right, places where, I would want to be in a place like this, in a safe zone, right, and I would hope that other people who are diverse and have other circumstances in their lives, that they would feel safe to be in an environment like this, right, according to these other characteristics that are listed here. So I think that's part of what we can think about in terms of negotiation. And Martin Luther King also talked about self-purification and talked about, would you be willing to accept harm without retaliating, right? These are real, how would your reaction be if you were to, experience something as someone who's an ally, for example, to somebody of a different race or ethnicity or sexual orientation or other characteristic? Would you accept harm without retaliating on their behalf? Would you endure the ordeal of jail? Right, and this is what he was writing from the Birmingham jail in terms of standing up for people. How far would you go? Not letting things pass, right? So if you were in a restaurant or a family conversation or some kind of event, and you heard something that was a stereotypical or prejudice against another person, would you let it pass? Would you remain silent, or would you say something? Would you address this? Would you stand up for others and be an ally in an unaccepting or even hostile environment? Right. So it talks about the character of what you would do in terms of self-purification, in terms of addressing some of these injustices that exist. And then direct action, the fourth component of what Martin Luther King was describing. This is education, advocacy. This is direct action, right? Taking a stand, continually promoting diversity and inclusion, participating in vigils and sit-ins and demonstrations or marches, right, for others or for your own group, advancing an understanding of intersectionalities, right, by race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and other characteristics. Right? So this is direct action. This is actually actively promoting inclusion. And I think it's important to think about and learn from other movements and other time periods, certainly the Civil Rights Movement and the LGBTQI2-S movement and other social movements. And I think that it's important when we see some political things and media-driven things about separating people and dividing people. I think it's important to think about what's happened throughout history. And Pastor Niemöller's statement was especially poignant after World War II. And it said that first they came for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. And then they came for the Catholics, and I didn't speak up for them because I was Protestant. And they came for me, and by that time no one was left to speak up. I think that's poignant and definitely something that resonates when we see events like this and different aspects of people separating, and the real need for systems of care to reflect on people coming together and being resilient as a larger community. So thank you. I wanted to also open up the lines and ask, provide an opportunity to, if anyone wanted to talk about the Pride events this last month and some of the things, reactions maybe that they had in their local communities, post the Orlando event, if there's anything that you wanted to discuss, we can go ahead and open the lines. Okay, so we've got all lines open now, and if anybody wanted to discuss anything, we've got a good 10 minutes, and please feel free to share.
This is Kathy. I just wanted to, I just wanted to thank you for that presentation, and it really does make you think, and I'm thinking about what are some of the ways that we are responding and some of the things that I've heard. And I spoke with this therapist just the other day who was starting in her community. She's starting to get a reputation for working with transgender young people and youth and adults, and she was really happy about that. And at the same time, so a school actually asked her if she would speak, speak in their school to a young, a grammar school, and she was really excited to do that. And she eventually had to say no because, she said no because of this fear. Her community was not that accepting. She had heard some things on the radio, on a radio station that made her fear the fact that if it was out there in a sense that she was providing, therapy to transgender youth and young people, that she would lose half her client base. And I think that that's a real fear out there, and it just was a reminder to me that that's why this work is so important.
Absolutely, and it's tough, right? If it was easy, it would just happen on its own, but it takes individual efforts and then people actively standing up for others. And and I understand, I totally empathize, with some of these situations where people, they're hesitant, and I get the hesitation, but we have to do what we can for other people and stand up for others as much as possible. It's I also run into this when, we've got, through the behavioral health disparities impact statement work, right, SAMHSA is saying that the programs need to collect data that are inclusive, right, to have race data, ethnicity data, gender data, and LGBT, questions or, intakes or some kind of data tracking of disparities. And well, you got to ask the question at some point, right, to make those comparisons, to collect that data. And we run into all kinds of different, scenarios about people being really hesitant or, cautious and, just, I don't know, try to avoid it, I guess, in some instances. But, I keep saying it's a standard quality of care. It's not that you're collecting these data to, just for the sake of doing paperwork or, doing reports or, whatever, some bureaucratic requirement, but it's an opportunity to improve the quality of services. And then how the questions are asked, hesitation around asking people and, things like that. Well, there's no way around it. There's got to be a inclusive, affirming way to, get the data or ask the questions, or maybe the timing of, when it's asked, or the appropriateness of the timing, right? Maybe not on the first visit, or, something like that, but at some point during the program, there should be an opportunity for somebody to express who they are, and how they identify. And that's why I think it's important that system of care organizations have an inclusive employment policy, right, that protects their staff and specifically addresses race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation, right, so that staff are protected and they don't feel like they're sticking their neck out, by being an ally or even just collecting the data or, doing their jobs. So I think that's something that, it's going to be, it's an ongoing issue. It's an ongoing thing. It's just not easy for communities to adjust to diversity and inclusion in some areas, and I get that, but, this is where we are as a country, and, we are a diverse and inclusive country, and, it's who we are and what we do. So federal programs that are, out there and support the work, they state that and they require that. So, there's just trying to help things along, and, how to best do that. That's always going to be something, that we'll need to look at and assist with. And I'm happy to, to be able to do that type of work. Well, I think we've got 5 minutes left, so I don't know. Kathy, were you, or was anyone else on the call? Did you go to a Pride event this month?
I wanted to talk about one community that I know that, they were feeling after what happened in Orlando that they weren't sure what they should do in their own community. And one of the things that they decided to do was they decided an action that was going to be really helpful was for them to really take a look at, their system of care and look at it from all the different, levels in the system of care. Looking at the policies and looking at policies and procedures and how welcoming or helpful was that, or was there anything in there that they could do to improve the services and support that they were doing for the LGBT community. They looked at their management, which included things like human resource development, and their hiring practices and their support of people, and these people feel safe within their own organizations. They looked at, the frontline practice level as well. Are we doing everything we can in terms of the assessments, and as you said, in terms of collecting the data, in terms of service planning, and if people are doing integrated kinds of service planning or wraparound, or care management, are there services and supports in place? Do we have people that actually know how to provide the kind of trauma-informed care that you were talking about earlier? And then, of course, I think one of the main things that people were looking at was, do we have the kinds of community partnerships in place? Partnerships with families, whether it's a peace-like organization, with the LGBT support organization, with youth groups that are out there. And so they really did kind of an inventory of the community types of partnerships that they had to help support their LGBT population. And I just thought that was a really proactive way of kind of a response. I mean, they weren't, they didn't necessarily, although they put in place some increased counselors in case they saw an increase in the counseling need, some of the trauma pieces, but I thought that, this was another way to address and, figure out kind of some of the ways for them to take action on what happened. So.
Wow, that's great. Is this like a committee that they formed, or this is an organizational, leadership-driven?
It was leadership-driven, I would say. Somebody just really was just ready to do that kind of work and to do that kind of, really to look at their own organization. And actually what's great is that they're using the foundation of the class standards in order to do that kind of look. But then they're looking at the LGBT population in particular, but using the foundation of the class standards. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And even in some of the states where we've seen like our NOW-S learning community, where we talked about the different state policies that were being passed, right? The trying to refuse services to people who are either transgender or by sexual orientation, etc. That there is a whole network of people who are trying to do what they can within the health and human services organizations within these states, within systems of care, who are reacting, or addressing some of these policies in a very positive and affirming way, where they are, forming work groups, and they're, making sure that they have inclusive service policies, and making it so that there's a assurance to the communities that they're serving that, yes, we had a state law, for example, that says, somebody can, if they believe they, in their own beliefs, that they feel like they can refuse, services to, these people. They have made it so that at an organizational level, that is definitely the expectation, is that if you're doing health and human services, that you provide services to everyone, and that it's an open, diverse, and inclusive, way of providing services. So I think that's, it's encouraging to see these things at the ground level. These things don't get on the news, right? So, sometimes we can kind of see the media trend going along, and it seems like there isn't much that's being done about, this wave of sort of anti-other legislation that's going on, but there's definitely a groundswell, and I certainly hope that this network of people at a local level will connect with one another as well across these different states and in different communities, because I think that's where the sharing of lessons learned can be promoted and leveraged. So it's encouraging when we see these things, people coming together rather than separating after things that, events, whether it's a tragic event like Orlando, or, a negative policy, was passed, or some kind of legislative action, that the people are definitely coming together around it. Well, I think we're right toward the end of our call, unless anyone had any other things that they wanted to raise or any questions, and always, we certainly are an open, available resource for you to connect with about any follow-up questions of what we've discussed today, and any other technical assistance needs that you might have.
Yes, Peter, thank you, and thank you for bringing up, as I said, some of the issues that you brought up, and some of the responses from communities, and what we do, how we do need to respond, including trauma-informed care, and looking at policies and procedures, the whole notion of promoting resilience, and promoting conflict resolution, and some of those things may be difficult things to do within your own community, and oftentimes it is easier to have sometimes it's easier to have somebody from within the community do it. Sometimes it's easier to have somebody from outside the community to come in and help provide some of the education or the conflict resolution types of things that you might have. So again, we just appreciate your time. Peter, thank you again, and thank you all for joining us. It is recorded, and it will be available within the next few days or into next week. And we look forward to hopefully you joining us in a couple months when we have our next call and discussion. And if you have any topics or would like to hear about anything particular, please don't hesitate to contact either Peter or myself, or somebody at the University of Maryland. And we hope you all enjoy a long holiday weekend if you're able to do that. So thank you.
All right, take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.